In this video I'm showing how I replace the power cord for a Bissell Spotclean Pro model 3624. If I turn it to the side here, you can see that the cord appears to have been gnawed off by some sort of feral meth hound.
That's my best friend. She a real bad bitch, drive her own car. She don't need no lift.
Full disclosure here, I made a previous video where I replaced the hose on this vacuum, and since the recording and editing for these videos is a ton of work, I am reusing some of that footage for the teardown. So you might notice a couple inconsistencies, but all the steps are there, so let's get started. To begin, I peeled the sticker off so that I could access the screws under it. In total, there are 5 screws underneath of this sticker that need to be removed. These screws hold the reel in place that the hose wraps around, so once they're removed, it should come right off. I went ahead and removed the clean water tank and the dirty water tank to get those out of the way. On the other side of the vacuum, there's some screws that we need to remove as well. I set the power cord to the side to get it out of the way. Then I remove these 2 screws that are in the power cord holder, as well as these 2 screws at the bottom, and then the 1 screw at the top. Now back around to the other side. There is 1 screw at the top to remove, and then another 2 screws at the bottom. There's also a screw underneath of where the clean water tank was that will need to be removed as well. And at this point you should be able to remove both halves of the plastic housing. These 2 screws that hold the tubes from the dirty water tank will need to be removed, as well as these 2 screws that hold the top of the vacuum to the base. These are at kind of a weird angle, so it helps to have a longer screwdriver here. There are 2 more screws here that hold the top of the base to the vacuum, so these will also need to be removed. And at this point you should be able to lift up on the top of the vacuum and remove it from the base. There's 6 screws here that hold the handle together. Each of these will need to be removed. Then the 2 halves of the handle should come apart pretty easily. There is a spring behind the power button, so just be careful that that doesn't fire off into the cosmos, never to be seen again. You can see here the power cord is routed through the plastics, and it's held in place by a washer and a screw. That screw will need to be removed, and then you should be able to wiggle the power cord out of the plastics. I got the replacement power cord from partswarehouse.com. This was my first time using this site, and it was actually surprisingly good. For my vacuum, they had a pretty comprehensive diagram, and just about every part was for sale. My only beef with them is that the cord for my vacuum was really expensive, and I searched for that part number on other sites and it was kind of expensive everywhere. So what I settled on was just buying a power cord from another model. In the end, it's just 3 wires, a hot, neutral, and ground, so you could probably even cannibalize one from another electronic if you have something laying around. Anyhow, I'll leave a link to the one I got in the description. So back to the vacuum here, I needed to remove the old power cord from the mix. I cut the wire tie, and then I cut the hot wire just below where it was crimped with this butt connector. I cut the other wire tie that was bundling the other wires together, and then I cut the wires for the ground just below the crimp, and then cut the wires for the neutral. Now that the wiring for the old power cord was completely disconnected from the vacuum, I could pull it out of the plastics. Then I fed the wiring from the new power cord through the hole. This is probably a symptom of this power cord being intended for a different model vacuum, but I didn't have enough exposed wiring to work with. So I took a utility knife and I very carefully cut the jacket back to expose more wire. Just be careful, don't cut yourself, don't burn your house down, don't come sue me, YouTube safety disclaimer. I'm using this crimping kit that I got from Amazon to connect the new power cord. I put a twist in the ends of the wires so that it would be easier to get the connectors on. I started with the hot wire and put one of the connectors on, and then crimped it down. And gave it a small tug just to make sure it was on there. Then I repeated these steps with the neutral. And finally the ground. Since I had just hacked off the old power cord with a pair of snips, I needed to strip the wires so that I could make a connection. Again, I started with the hot wire first and stripped back a little bit of insulation. Then I moved on to the neutrals, and then finally the grounds. Back to that hot wire now, I inserted it into the other end of the connector and crimped it down. And again, just gave it a tug to make sure it wasn't going anywhere. For the neutrals, they were a little more fiddly because there were 2 wires going in one side of the connector. I actually had to strip off a little bit more insulation from these guys so that I could get them into the connector, but it worked all the same. And then same thing again with the grounds. 2 wires, I just twisted them together, put them into the connector, and then crimped them down. I also ran some electrical tape around all of the connections that I made just to add some reinforcement. And just to try to keep things sorta neat, I zip tied the grounds and neutrals back together the way I found them. And at this point I was able to start putting the plastics back together. I forced the power cord down into the groove in the plastics, and then I put the screw and washer back in place so that it would stay put. Now the power button is probably the hairiest part of this whole thing. I had okay luck compressing the spring with my fingers and then putting the button in place. It's just a little tricky while you're getting the plastics back in place to not have the spring come flying out of there. In my case, I turned it over and put all 6 screws back in before realizing that I couldn't press the power button. Apparently this button is not symmetrical, so when you're putting it back together, just make sure you have it in the right orientation. Otherwise, you could be like me and have to take the handle apart again and flip the button over. Next, I lowered the top of the vacuum back onto the base and reinstalled these 4 screws that hold the top and bottom together, as well as the 2 in the back. Then I could put the plastic housing back on. I started with this smaller black piece, and then I put the larger plastic on next. Everything should sort of snap together and hold itself in place even before you put the screws in. As for the screws on this side, I put back the 1 in the top, 2 in the power cord holder, and then lastly the 2 in the bottom. Around to the other side with the hose, again there is 1 screw in the top, and then 2 in the bottom. And then the hose reel goes back on, along with the 5 screws that hold it in place. And just don't forget the 1 final screw underneath of where the clean water tank goes. And that's pretty much it. I'm going to wrap up this nice new power cord here, slap the sticker back in place on the other side, and get it loaded up with the tank so that I can test it out. I've used it several times since recording this video, and it's working fine so far. It was just a power cord, so I wasn't really expecting a lot of craziness from it. But since replacing a power cord is a whole lot cheaper than replacing the whole vacuum, hopefully this helps somebody out there save a couple dollars. That's pretty much it. Hit like if this video was helpful, and thanks for watching.